Okay, so now we're going to talk about the basics of DSLR shooting with the camera. Of course, that means getting to know your camera a little bit more. When you're shooting in automatic mode, you don't really have to know a whole lot about the features that are available on your camera. You simply have to know how to turn it on, make sure you have a memory card put in, and just point and shoot and take a photo, which basically means you're using your DSLR camera as a point and shoot camera. This is what we're trying to get away from because, as I'm sure you know, and we've seen in other photos, having the control over those situations, taking away the auto capability and becoming a manual shooter gives us much better flexibility with our photography. So there are things that we're going to be looking at in this camera and features that we're going to be looking at. The main things that we're going to be learning is how to manually set our shutter speed, our aperture, and our ISO. Those are the three key ingredients to using manual mode. Of course, there are other things that are unlocked inside of our camera, such as menu settings and things like that, that we're allowed to do when we take it out of automatic and go into manual mode. But just to get you out of auto is our goal, and we're going to look at the things that are required in order to do that. So in your camera, and I hope you could see this well in this image, we have some numbers on our camera screen. Sometimes some cameras might not have this display here. It might be on the back of the screen, or it might be somewhere else, but on this camera we have those numbers displayed here. We have our ISO, we have our aperture, and our shutter speed. Now, the difference between these are as follows. The aperture is how much light is being let in through your lens. If you've ever looked into your lens, and as I described when we were talking about lenses, if you've ever looked through your lens and seen the opening that your lens has, that's the aperture opening and closing to let in a certain amount of light. The shutter speed is how long the shutter is left opened on your camera. The shutter is inside of your camera, and it's this mirror right here. How long is the shutter staying opened and the sensor that's behind that mirror being exposed? When the sensor is exposed, light is hitting it and also your image, and it's capturing that. The longer the shutter is exposed, the more light. So that's another feature. And then ISO is light sensitivity. How sensitive is the image to the light that's coming in? You can set it relatively low, which means that it's not going to be very sensitive, and then you can set it really high, which means it's going to be really sensitive, but you're also going to see degrading factors in that as well. On different cameras, we have different knobs and switches to adjust that stuff. On this camera, which is the Canon 60D, we can adjust our shutter speed with this rocker right here. We could adjust our aperture with this rocker back here. And then we can adjust our ISO with this button right here, and then this rocker adjusts that number. Now, different cameras are going to have different settings for that. For example, on this Canon EOS M, I'm going to go ahead and turn this camera on, and it's set in manual mode right now. And I'm going to point it just down here, and hopefully you can see this. Everything is adjustable from the back of the camera, which does make it a little bit harder, but typically this is the kind of camera that you're holding out in front of you and shooting with instead of holding it in front of your face, because the actual eyepiece viewfinder is an add-on for this camera, and it doesn't come built in. So you tap, and you have a slider to adjust your shutter speed here. We also have a slider to adjust our aperture, and then we also have a slider to adjust our shutter speed, our ISO as well. So it does make it a little bit more challenging, but that's another way that you can adjust those settings and get manual functionality out of a camera, such as something more standard of a point and shoot. Decent point and shoot cameras have these features these days to be able to go and automatically adjust and set those settings to where we want them. A Canon camera such as the Digital Rebel has similar buttons, but they're mostly on the back, and they are a little bit harder to get to. What's nice about these more professional level cameras is that these buttons are positioned in a way to where you can adjust them without looking at them. And that's where you truly become fast at this process, is being able to make these adjustments without looking down at your camera or anything like that. Being able to look through the eyepiece and make those adjustments on the fly while you're trying to frame up and take a picture are pretty much key when it comes to taking a picture quickly. And when we start looking at ISO and all of these different features in depth in a different video, we'll be able to see how those are affected in the image. So those are key features. Of course, there are other settings in the menu that we can get into and look at as well. As far as other settings outside of the camera, our autofocus, we have different ways of setting that up. We have one shot, we have AI focus, and AI servo. Those are three different types of focus, of ways that your camera can focus. And I use AI focus, or AI servo, I'm sorry, because I typically have things that are moving in my shot. Not all the time are things staying still. One shot is good for that. When you know you're taking a picture of something and you don't need your camera to do much refocusing or thinking, set it on one shot and then go ahead and you're able to grab that shot without refocus or anything like that happening. If you want focus to be able to track or change, you will need to go and switch into AI servo. Even AI focus is a better option than one shot when it comes to that. So, but for the most part, you'll be able to use one shot, or even AI servo won't be a problem. One shot won't be a problem either, because you're most likely just going to be focusing on one thing at a time and not worry about things moving. But you can try both and see what works best for you. Another button that we have here is our drive. Do we want it to take just one shot when we push down the shutter? Do we want it to take multiple? This camera also has a high speed option as well. So we're taking one shot, then I move it into high speed, and it takes multiple shots. And then I can move it into time delayed countdown shot. And this camera has a 10-second countdown and a 2-second countdown, depending on what option you want to go with. So there's a couple different shooting options there. And then other options, we also on the back of this camera have a zoom, and we also have an AF on, which activates your autofocus without hitting the shutter button. So if I want to refocus something, I can hold down this AF on button. Now, one thing that comes in handy, because we have a live view on the back of our camera, for example, if I go into live view on the back of this camera, and this is going to be kind of hard to see, if I'm having a hard time focusing on something, I can use this zoom button to zoom in on the item and then focus manually really tight and make sure that I get, a sharp focus on whatever that item is. Now, it's a little bit harder of an option to use. Typically, we use it more when we're locked down on a tripod or even using a monopod, but it does come in handy being able to do that when your camera is having a hard time focusing. So those are the main buttons on the top of the camera, and a couple of them on the back. As far as customizing those, some of those buttons you can customize and set to do different things in the menu. I tend to just kind of leave them where they're at, because otherwise then I'm going to have to go and customize all of my cameras and set them up differently. The settings that they come with from the factory as far as which buttons do what typically works pretty good for me, and so I haven't had a need to go ahead and try and change those to fit some other need of mine. So over here where we have our mode selection, obviously we're going to be learning how to use manual mode. You are probably commonly used to using auto mode. We also have P, TV, AV. In this camera's options also have a B and a C, and then it also has some kind of auto settings for different situations on this camera. Some of your cameras are going to have those. For example, the Digital Rebel has that on some of its models. When you move up in a camera and you go to something like a 5D or something like that, you're going to lose a lot of those auto functions, because most people using that camera aren't going to be shooting in those auto functions. They're going to have an understanding of those features and how to use them. So there are these features in the camera, and one interesting way to learn what your camera is doing is to even try using some of those auto features and then see what your camera ended up doing when it took the picture. But like I said, we're trying to get away from that. One of the ways that I learned how to figure out how the camera was working was just to reverse engineer a photo. If I took a photo in auto and it turned out really good, I would look at the settings for that, because it is recording the settings in the data of that photo, and you can look up that information in Photoshop or Lightroom and even in the back of your camera, and it'll say, 1/20th of a second, maybe 5.4 on the f-stop and the ISO 200, and you're looking at those numbers and kind of understanding what combinations tend to work. So that's another way of kind of learning how to better take photos in manual. Of course, like we've said in the past, using the auto mode is not quite as forgiving when it comes to lighting situations that are kind of challenging. So there are lots of buttons on the camera. Not all of them will you end up using. Even as a professional, there are several buttons that I don't end up using often on my camera, but I wanted you to have just a general understanding of where these buttons were, because when we start looking at these features more in depth, you're going to have to figure out where these are on your camera, and knowing what buttons do what and how to adjust those settings is going to be important, because in using manual, you have to be fast at this, or you might miss your moment or your opportunity to take a photo. So in our next videos, we're going to be taking a look at each of those features in depth so that you can really understand how they work and how they affect your photo.